Hello, everyone. I think we're live. Welcome to LearnIt, the Vinci's innovation and foresight platform. Among our activities, we have two startups programs, Seed, to help new startups structure their business plan, and Catalyst. The Catalyst program was launched in January and is designed to foster and accelerate partnerships between Vinci and startups or scale-ups in their commercial development phase. Today is the fifth of our 11 daily online presentation of startups from our Catalyst program and their exchanges with operational business units from Vinci. So I would like to begin by thanking our panelists today and the audience for your virtual presence. Today you'll hear about Kenzen with Kenzen CEO Heidi Lehmann. She will exchange with Balazs Gombos, who is a business unit director at Soletanche Bachy Maroc. We'll first hear the presentation of Kenzen and its value proposition for 10 to 15 minutes. Then Balazs will explain his role at Vinci. After that, I do have some questions on their potential collaboration. You can also ask your question in the chat, and I will be your voice at the end of the exchange. And during Heidi's presentation, you can click on the slides to see them in a bigger window. Heidi, hi, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you to everybody for tuning in on a Friday afternoon. It's nice to have you here with us. Is now a time for me to share my screen, Louis, and begin? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about Kenzen. So at Kenzen, we are building the premier physiological platform to keep workforces safe from heat, fatigue, and overexertion on the job. So the front end of our industrial platform is a patch, which I am wearing right here. You can see the size of it about right here. And this patch samples a worker's physiology every 5 seconds. And what it does is it can detect the slightest nuances that indicate a worker is about to become ill or have an injury from these health conditions that, while invisible, are very detrimental and can easily take not just one worker, but an entire workforce down. So our initial condition that we're beginning with is heat. And heat takes two forms for us. There is exertional heat, and that is heat from I'm working very hard, it's very hot, I'm wearing a good degree of PPE, so I'm at risk for heat injury or illness. Or it could also be fever, where my temperature is elevated, and due to a fever, I'm at risk of some sort of an infectious disease, and I may infect the entire workforce, so it's better that I take a break and go home. So just a bit about Kenzen. We were founded in 2015. We've raised about $8 million in funding to date. We're divided between 3 different places. Our corporate headquarters is in New York City. Our operations is in Kansas City, the heart of the industrial Midwest. And then all our science is from Silicon Valley. So Kenzen really got its start in sports and in science. We began with a Swiss innovation grant, which is where we really began to perfect our algorithms around core body temperature, which is how we're detecting a lot of the temperature injuries, both from exertional heat and then from fever. We also won something in 2016 called the Techcrunch Future Athlete Award. And this was judged by Nike, Condoleezza Rice, and the NFL. And subsequently, we got a grant from the NFL and some investment from the San Francisco 49ers, which is an American football team, and some other sports teams as well. So we did a lot of our testing in sports with some of the top sports trainers, teams, and physiologists. As you know, workers are up for a lot of the same risks that professional athletes are. So this was a great way for us to make sure our technology was exactly where it needed to be when we began to scale into industrial workforces. So now we're fully committed to protecting construction workers on the job in very hot environments, lone workers who may be working by themselves out in the heat and not have any way to protect themselves, or those in factories, around smelters, or in confined spaces where core body temperature can elevate very quickly. We began with pilots in renewable energy, in construction, and in oil and gas field services to perfect our workforce and the way that we were going to scale across these large industrial conglomerates, and now we are rolling out commercially. So speaking first about exertional heat, if you think about some of the conditions that cause heat injury, so high exertion, I'm working very hard, poor acclimatization, I've been resting for the weekend, now I'm back at work, or the temperature was 50 degrees yesterday, now it's 70 degrees, poor hydration or high heat index. The sensors and the algorithms that we have are designed specifically to address this type of condition. So if you think about heart rate or activity in motion, these are things that can be detected with basically anything that you might wear on your wrist, any type of fitness tracker. But where we really excel is with our core body temperature. And this is something where a ground truth measurement can only be ascertained through an ingestible pill or a rectal thermometer. And neither of those, as you can imagine, scales very well on a work site. So we've taken a lot of time to perfect our readings around this. Then we're also pulling in local temperature and local humidity so we can better understand the microclimate. So heat injury is 100% preventable if it's detected early, but it's very difficult to know it's happening until it's taken a huge toll on the hydration, cognition, and dexterity of a workforce, putting individuals at risk very quickly. So just from putting on PPE, which a worker might need just to go out and begin a day, they are at risk because 1 degree body temperature can increase very quickly just from putting on this additional garb that a worker needs to keep them safe on the job. So as we are looking at fever and the heat risk around that, what we've discovered is that a lot of workforces are typically looking now at screening their workforce in a socially distanced manner with a fever gun, which is one point in time. What we're doing is continuously monitoring a worker's physiology for increased temperature that could indicate fever, because a spot check only gets a worker at the time when they're entering the workplace, or at one point in time on the job, where we're looking every 5 seconds to see if there's been an increase in temperature. We also offer utmost privacy, whereas when a worker is in a line, it might be very clear if they're asked to step aside because their temperature is elevated. And so fever risk, which wasn't on our radar screen very highly until just a few months ago, but elevated fever can mean a lot of things. So certainly it could mean COVID-19, it could mean seasonal flu, and it could also mean tuberculosis, which is something that runs rampant in mines in many cases as well. So Kenzen really considers itself a safety technology, but ultimately, if workers are more fit for duty, there's less days away from work, less hospitalization, you're going to keep workers' compensation and other hospitalization costs to the company much lower. So we just came to market with a new product, the one that I'm wearing right here. So we piloted with one version of this and then made some modifications based on feedback we got from the work sites. So the product is now completely waterproof, whereas before it was just water resistant. It is designed for intrinsic safety, which becomes very important, specifically with oil and gas and mining customers. We will have that certification by the end of the year. It is ruggedized for industrial use, which basically means, I wouldn't advise this, but you can jump up and down on it and it will not break. It has a 30-hour runtime, a 1-hour time to recharge, and it runs on low energy Bluetooth. So as I mentioned, the patch is really the front end of a comprehensive system that is built for industrial use. So the patch is the data collection piece. It moves up into Microsoft Azure Cloud, which is where our machine learning and AI happens. And then there's 3 different forms of visualization. Each has very specific privacy protocols to it. Kenzen takes privacy extremely seriously. So those 3 archetypes are the worker, the safety manager, and then corporate intelligence. So our platform was really designed with the worker in mind. The worker is the only one that can see all of their biometric data in real time and retrospectively. So the experience for them is they will get the patch, they will put this on their physiology, on their body, and it will understand them specifically. So everybody is going to have a different physiological reading. I might get hotter than somebody else at a different time. So it's important we understand everybody individually. And then we benchmark that against a governing body like an OSHA, for example. So the patch is worn for about 30 minutes. The first time it's worn, then we'll understand that individual. And then if an individual is working and their temperature is calibrating in a dangerous direction, they will get an alert that will tell them to stop work. They will rest. It will give them an idea of how long they need to rest. There'll be another alert when it's safe for them to go back to work. Now, we definitely understand that on construction sites, frankly, as well as in mines and in oil and gas, sometimes carrying a phone is either not allowed or it's disruptive to the workflow. So in that case, the patch is haptic, so it will vibrate when a worker is getting an alert. But the safety manager is also going to be able to monitor their team via a web-based tablet. So they will see their entire team, and what they'll understand is if a member is in a dangerous calibration zone for heat stress, or if they have dismissed an alert. If they've dismissed an alert, then the safety manager can intervene and say, you need to sit down, you need to take a break, or if it's possibly a fever, they would just tap them and say, you need to step aside, just be in a room for a little bit, and we'll have a medical professional come in and talk to you and see how you're doing. So the safety manager does not see all the biometric data. All they see is if an intervention is needed and what they need to do. So the third viewer is EHS intelligence. And so essentially, EHS professionals and corporate are going to see all of the data, but they are going to see it retrospectively, so after the fact, and it's going to be de-identified. And for them, it's just understanding trends to make the workforce more safe. So the fourth persona here, which I'll mention, is going to be a medical professional. So a medical professional, if a worker was in severe need of help, would be able to see all of the worker's biometric data so they could assist as rapidly and as effectively as possible. But obviously a medical professional worker, that's like a client's attorney privilege, so that information would stay exclusively between them. So looking at this in context, here's a worker on a construction site. He's wearing the patch. It's vibrating perhaps if he's at risk for a heat-related injury. If for some reason he's unable to respond or dismisses the alerts, then the safety manager can step in and take whatever action is appropriate to keep the worker safe. So as I mentioned, we have done pilots throughout the globe with top industrial conglomerates focused primarily on construction, renewable energy, oil and gas. We are about to start mining. We've piloted in the US, in the UK, in the Middle East, and we're about to start in South Africa and South America shortly. So goals and outcomes, as we've looked both at pilots and enterprise deployments, number one have certainly been avoiding heat injury, fever, and illness on the site. Exertional heat injury, again, 100% preventable if it's detected early. Quantifying dangerous work environments and then making modifications based on that quantification. Looking at specific job analysis and understanding how we make those jobs more safe and with less risk. And then even making capital investments. So we did some work early on with renewable energy technicians, wind power technicians that had to climb up 300 feet to the top of a wind tower before they began their day, which could often be 12 hours at the top. So based on some feedback we got and data over time, lift assists were put in some of those wind towers. And then another example might be just a lighter form of PPE. If workers are showing up, and in many cases they are in the summer months, already at high risk for heat injury and dehydration. So we do pilots, but our basic model is a subscription SaaS-based service. So the average is $40 per worker per month. We have 3 different models that we tend to work with. One is seasonal. So this would be outdoor workers where it's simply hot 6 months of the year, but not the other 6. Yearly, where either you're in a climate where it's hot all the time, or you're looking for exertional heat injury, perhaps in the summer, but more fever detection in the winter. Or perhaps you're in a smelter environment where part of the workforce or part of the workplace is moderate climate, but you're around smelters enough year round that an elevated core body temperature control is necessary and useful. The third, which is seasonal exchange. So this would be for workforces where perhaps they've got a business unit in Australia, but they also have a business unit in Canada, and their summers are at different times. So it's essentially a yearly contract, but where devices would be exchanged or at least turned on and off. We're not exchanging devices as much just because of COVID-19 and trying to stay very hygienic and cleanly, but certainly there'd be activation between the two different workforces at different times. So I often get asked the question, and this is actually somewhat of an old piece of data at this point, what types of data might we get from working with Kenzen, and when would a worker get a heat alert? So this is an example of a wind technician POC that we actually did in Indiana, which is in the US Midwest. And so this was a workforce that were wind technicians that were used to climbing, making repairs at the top. But on a particularly hot summer day, they were not doing that. They were cutting pipe in a very hot field, carrying very heavy equipment and with a lot of PPE on that they weren't used to wearing. So essentially everybody started getting heat alerts at the same time when they were doing this work. Later in the day, right around here, they resumed their regular work of climbing up the towers and doing things, and then the heat alerts dropped. So it just showed by doing a rigorous activity with elevated PPE and elevated equipment, heat injury became very, very dangerous for the entire workforce. And so looking at the results for us, this was a very effective pilot because it showed the accuracy of when the alerts were thrown. And then another question we often get is, how accurate is the sensor data and the algorithms that you're creating? So we have been testing with universities, amongst ourselves, with sports teams, and then on our pilots to make sure our accuracy is as close as possible. So this is benchmarking against an ingestible pill. And it may look like there's quite a bit of difference, and there's a little bit, but it's about 0.05%. So the accuracy is very good and very stable, and it continues to perfect itself. And so we do have a network of universities that we are testing with at different times. So they include sugarcane harvesters in Nicaragua, firefighters in New Zealand, field workers in Australia, and then others. So we're continually gathering as much data as possible in different environments with different types of exertional workloads. And this is just a quick look at the team. So myself, I'll also call out Nicole Moyen, who's our head of R&D. She looks very young in that picture, and she is very young, but she's had a good deal of experience. So she's a heat specialist out of Fitbit, Stanford PhD, and knows heat injury both on the fever detection and the exertional heat side better than just about anybody. Dr. Robert Arduino, who is an infectious disease specialist, and then Kyle Hubrex, who has about 20 years of industrial workforce experience across logistics, transportation, and oil and gas. So I can stop there. That was probably a lot of information, but I welcome your questions, and thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you, Heidi. That was really complete. Balazs, hello to you. Can you describe your role at Soletanche Bachy in a few words, and maybe the type of sites that you have? So my role at Kenzen? I know that's for Balazs. Oh, sorry. Okay. Yep,
that's
sorry
for me.
I'm just so used to talking now. So yeah, please.
Well, you did a great presentation, Heidi. It was very amazing. Thank you, Luis. Hi, and hi to everyone who is following our exchange here. So I'm business unit manager in Soletanche Bachy, which is in the specialized engineering companies of the group Vinci. And I take care of Soletanche Bachy's activities in Morocco. Actually, Soletanche Bachy is the world leader in foundation and soil technologies, a company which is present in 60 countries in the world. And by the way, Morocco was the first country this company went outside of France in the 1930s, so have a long presence here. And we have a wide range of activities here in different building and infrastructure construction projects, like deep foundations for buildings or bridges, retaining walls, underground car parks, reservoir dam infrastructures, and so on. Just to give you two examples of projects we've done recently, we just finished less than a year ago the foundations of a 250-meter tall skyscraper building in Morocco's capital. The foundation goes down to 70 meters underground. It was a very interesting job site. Another interesting project we finished a few months ago was the construction of a wastewater sea outfall with an underground tunnel going 1 kilometer into the ocean, under the ocean bed from the shore. So this is the kind of things we do here.
And Balazs, what are your main challenges regarding workers' safety? Obviously it, but how do you prevent those today?
Yeah, actually in our group, safety is a real priority in our everyday's work. And we follow very closely all the health and safety related issues. We have, of course, a number of risks which are not at all concerning the temperature. For instance, falling from height, falling objects, hand injuries, just to give you a few examples. But as our workers are working most of the time outside, they are quite, all environment, ambient temperature conditions and so on can generate risk to our staff. So for the moment, we have good risk control measures on those that we implement gradually, depending on the actual temperatures. And we tell them how frequently and how much a person shall drink water or something, and how frequently they have to take rest in a cool place, in a cool container or something like that. But still, we don't have actual data or return of experience on how well we manage those issues. And actually, Morocco is not a very hot country, so we don't have extremely high temperatures. It's not like the Middle East, for instance, but still it can get pretty hot. And we have a period every year, which is the month of Ramadan, where Muslims have to fast from sunrise to sunset, which means that we keep our activities going during this period, and we take special measures to shorten the shifts and pay attention to the workload of the people and so on. But still, it means that people have to work, for instance, 8 hours without drinking. So it's a very critical thing, and I think that if today there is the technology to make sure no one gets hurt, well, I think that's obviously interesting for us.
And we had some discussions on this period before the COVID crisis.
Yeah.
Heidi, I wanted to get back to you with something that I think you told us during your presentation. Though the Kenzen tech needs 3G, 4G connectivity to work?
So the way it works is it needs just low energy Bluetooth to get to the patch, but the patch to the cloud, which is where the machine learning is going to happen, it does need cellular connectivity. Yes.
But as usually, what is your policy regarding cell phones? Your workers have the cell phones on them, or it's not something that they do have?
Well, actually, they can have the cell phones on them. They cannot use it during the working hours and during the activity. On the other hand, we can have some remote work sites. As I told, we do, for instance, reservoir dam infrastructures, which are in the mountains where we don't have all the time the cell coverage. So that can be an issue. But as I understood, your patch has an autonomy of a couple of days. So
yeah, so a couple of things. So we've learned a lot just from doing our POCs, just about the different types of workforces. So most work sites don't allow phones on sites. So although we pilot with phones typically, just because that helps us with control groups and data accuracy for that specific exercise. What we found is, lone workers, so wind turbine technicians, field workers, even those in transportation that are in trucks doing things like delivery people or logistics or what have you. That's a category that can have a cell phone with them. But oil and gas and mining and construction, either because of explosive issues, so that's why we went for our intrinsic safety certification, or it's just disruptive to the workflow, phones are not allowed. And so in the future, and we're exploring these integration partners now, I think we've got 3 in place, so we can easily go through a wireless hub, and so then no phone is going to be required. So I feel like the scale that we're going to see in the majority of our deployments will not have phones over the next year or so, except for those that are remote and they need a phone anyway just to stay in touch. So it's a safety issue for a lot of reasons, just locating them and them staying in touch, and they'd want to have access to all of their data. But phones are not a requirement in the future at all. That said, if you were using your phone and just as you suggested, connectivity is lost, so information can reside on the patch for up to 24 hours. So that's not necessarily as useful if you needed that real-time alert, certainly, but at least you would have the retrospective data for trend analysis. And we have had certain work sites. So there was a group of open pit miners in South America, and it was geologists. And what they were specifically interested in wasn't so much interventions, but it was more retrospective data. So they didn't want any real-time alerts or information at all. So it just depends, A, what the use case is, and then B, we've gotten fairly sophisticated and proficient in delivering real-time intervention, no matter what the technical setup and protocol is on a site.
Thank you, Heidi. Regarding development stage, I think you told us about it, but can you confirm that you're ready to deploy anywhere in Europe or Africa right now?
Yeah, so I think, so my sound went out for a minute, but it sounded like you were asking if we're ready to deploy anywhere across the globe. Is that? Yeah, so I'd say generally that's absolutely true. Every part of the globe we go to is going to have different protocols in terms of technology. So those are fairly simple. Intrinsic safety certification. So that's something that we're building into what we're doing. It looks a little bit different, for example, from the UK to South Africa. And then privacy protocols as well. And I think we've certainly come up with a very aggressive privacy policy that will cover the globe. That is something that we took very, very seriously, simply because we are handling biometric data of a workforce. So we wanted to treat it with the utmost discretion and care. In fact, we just received some new investment from a type of investor called an impact investor. And for those that aren't familiar, I'm sure many are, so impact investors certainly want to make a return on the capital they put in, but they also want to have some sort of global good that comes out of their investment. And so the 2 funds that we've taken capital from are either focused on worker safety, so keeping the worker safe, or worker rights and privacy. And when you take capital from these companies, you need to commit to covenants. So the covenant we commit to from the worker rights and privacy firm was coming up with a privacy policy that would set a precedent in the smart PPE space, or the smart personal protective space, which is the broader category that we're in. And so I feel like this was something that came up quite often early on, from unions, from safety managers, from privacy officers at large companies. And I think now, we can say with confidence, we're ready to deploy anywhere and handle data, very carefully.
And you also answered the GDPR compliant question that I have.
Absolutely.
Usually, again, for you, Heidi, usually how do you deploy with a company or with a construction site? What is the process and the different steps?
So typically we start with something that's going to look like a proof of concept. We call it an initial deployment typically. The reason that, to start, we were doing a lot of very separate proof of concepts and pilots, and we can still do that. But we had a good amount of requests to roll out fairly soon afterwards. So just to make sure we're prepared, we consider it an initial deployment, but it looks very much like a proof of concept where we would be ready to roll out to a larger group if there is success, if KPIs have been met. And so I'll talk about that process a little bit, but I'll also talk about what the KPIs look like, because that's always a question. So two are very straightforward. So one is just, is the device comfortable? Will users accept it? And this was a surprise to me initially, but that's number one. If a worker finds that it's too confining, it gets in the way, then that's a showstopper right there. You're not gonna get very far. In fact, the initial placement for this was actually on the chest. And we tested with a lot of women and a lot of men that I think didn't have much body hair. And so the minute we got it on work sites where there was more body hair, there was an adhesive, there were a lot of complaints that it was quite painful. And so those early POCs got shut down pretty quickly for that reason and that reason alone. So we found we could get all the readings we needed on the arm. And so this is now very acceptable and workforces like it. So that's always number one, interestingly enough. The second is scale, a technology scale. So the CIO, Chief Information Officer, or the IT officer, or the Chief Technology Officer gets involved really early on. And that surprised me too, because I was, you're thinking, well, we're doing this initial deployment with 10 or 15 people. Why do they need the top person here to evaluate it? But what they're looking at is, if this works, if it's something that we're going to move forward with, will it scale to our entire workforce, which could be thousands of people in different environments. So making sure that you've thought through that scalable deployment from a technology standpoint, that's very important. That becomes a KPI. But then, probably the most important as it actually relates to what we do to our product is just looking at the alerts and when we're sending them, and does that correlate to a variety of different things? So the environmental conditions, the workload that the worker is doing that day, and then perceptual feedback of the worker. And so the perceptual feedback would simply be things of how they felt working, what the workload was. Did they feel safer wearing it? Did they feel they were, hydrating more because of it? Interestingly, just knowing they were wearing this, a lot of the workers tend to actually rest and drink more and things like that. So the perceptual data actually becomes very, very important. And so that would be kind of the basis for the evaluation for this first proof of concept or initial deployment that we do. The way it works is it runs for maybe a month's time. We used to run pilots that went for about 3 months. And what we found was it was too long. You could really get the data you needed in less time with less people. So we typically start with 2 different groups of 5 to 10 individuals, and these groups would ideally be doing slightly different things on the workforce, slightly different exertional levels. So maybe one are more active, whereas others are more in one place, and it's still very hot, but they're not climbing or building in quite the same way. So we do one group first, and we have them wear it for about a week, and there we're collecting data ourselves. They're filling out surveys. Then we do the other group, same exercise for a week, and then we compare the data. We talk to the groups. We make sure that we feel that we're customized algorithmically for that work site. So each work site ultimately really comes away with a separate algorithm for them, because each environment is just a little bit different, and the workers and the physiology is a little bit different. And then we would roll out to the entire 10, and sometimes we'll tack on an extra 15 people just for statistical relevancy, where we deploy anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks with an entire group, just to kind of see that scale in action and the day-to-day use. And there wouldn't be as much everybody's filling out surveys, because that gets, once you get above 10 to 15 people, that gets very difficult to control. So that's essentially what an initial POC or pilot would look like. And then after that, it would, easily roll in, based on success on those KPIs, it could very easily roll into more of an enterprise deployment.
Right. About the general context, we obviously had a few questions about the possibility of using your sensor in detecting temperature peaks in this COVID-19 context. Is it something you are developing right now?
Yeah, so there's 2 things. So we look at it, the COVID-19 environment, good, better, and best. And we have something today that we consider to be in the better category, and then we're developing something in the best category. So let me explain. So today at many industrial sites, what's being put in place are a variety of things that are very good and are very necessary. So one is simply social distancing, right? So you need to stay 6 feet away from other workers on the job. One is just emphasizing cleanliness. So these are things we're all doing. So washing hands, making sure that we're staying clean, wearing masks on the work site whenever possible. So all these things should be done. And then the fourth part of this is fever detection, fever check. So this typically happens 2 ways. In fact, we're working with a mining company right now, and I think they put about $1 million USD into spot checking and then the monitors that you walk by. So when you are entering a work site, typically they will get your temperature, and then you'd be walking by a monitor and it would get your temperature again. So these are good. They present a 1 point in time analysis of what your temperature looks like. And most likely, if you are in a line to get in somewhere and you've got that elevated temperature and you're asked to step aside, then it comes into call privacy a little bit, right? Because you are asked to step aside in a line where they're trying to detect elevated temperature as it relates to fever. And so it's very obvious that probably something is not wrong and you're not feeling well. And then everybody's reviewing, was I too close to Heidi? What happened? Oh no. So, but that's good. These things need to happen. So we fall in when it comes to elevated temperature, fever detection, to what's a better category right now. And so that is that our patch is going to be able to understand if there is an elevated temperature continuously. So not just when you're entering, not just when you walk by, but throughout the entire day, because we are continually looking at temperature. So what we're not going to know is this due to exertional heat or is it fever? So these things can possibly be deduced just based on contextually what you're doing throughout the day, what season it is, that sort of thing. But what we would suggest and what our protocol is that if there is an elevated temperature, that person more discreetly be asked to just, go wait over here, and then you get a medical professional to come in and diagnose what a good next step would be. So we are not able, nor will we ever be able to, nor do we want to be able to differentiate and say, this person is at risk for a COVID-19, or this looks more like flu, or this looks more like TB. But what we can say is this person is off their core body temperature baseline. It makes sense for them to step away and have a medical professional assess them more thoroughly. Now, with our privacy in mind, because if it's throughout the day, and let's just say I'm working on a construction site, somebody can approach me in a much more discreet manner and say, Heidi, please step to the side, but I'm not in a line. It's not really clear what's going on. So my privacy can be maintained much more. Or if I've got a phone and I'm the worker, then I can just, go and say, look, I got this alert. What does it mean? So that's better. And that's what we have today. So best, and this is what we're developing. So once you have a fever, when you have a fever, you've actually already been infectious for up to 48 hours. So does this mean that you should still understand who has a fever on your site and probably remove them? 100%, absolutely. But the best scenario is if you can detect deviation from an individual's baseline even before they're contagious. So this is a different set of signals and criteria. So this involves looking at heart rate and core body temperature, but also HRV and circadian rhythm. And so this is what is in development for us right now, where we would understand what my baseline is, and if there's a deviation from it, same process, but I'm isolated or I'm asked to stay home or whatever the situation calls for before I'm at that level of infection. And so this becomes very important down the line. This is the ideal situation.
I think that answers one question from the audience. I will ask it whatever, but just to be sure. Yogesh Patel asked us, how close do you think you are to predicting worker illness? Have there been any tests, experiments to compare the accuracy of Kenzen illness detection other than temperature?
Yeah, so on the illness detection, so moving away from temperature and looking at illness, so we are at the beginning. We have a co-development relationship where we are working on testing and the protocols and making sure we've got the right amount of fever. So you actually have to have enough people that have a fever to then understand baseline and other detection and things like that. So we are at the very beginning phases of this co-development. So I think this is something that we will be working on, very closely over the next year. but it's probably nothing that's available in 2020 and probably at the end of 2021, depending on how our trials go. So, fever detection today, illness detection in development, but we recognize and certainly highlight that this is the ideal situation. Fever, you want to identify people that have a fever, but at that point, it's very likely they've already been contagious in an environment.
Thank you. Balazs, I would like to come back to you with this partnership, and I know we discussed this a bit before in our various exchanges. Partnering with startups has its challenges. Can you tell us if you already developed such partnerships, and what are the challenges according to you?
Well, Louis, it's the first time, obviously, for us, and as you told, we've just started to have some exchanges before the COVID crisis hit. But I believe that the most important thing is to get a very open-minded approach from both sides, because it's obviously a product being developed. As Heidi explained in her presentation, there were a lot of changes implemented in the product just with the return of experience of pilot projects and so on. So I think that this is very important in this case to know that this is not a commercialized product. I mean, this is not a widely commercialized product, but rather something which is being developed. So I think this is the most important to know that from the side of from my side, and in the same way to keep an open mind from the other side to our needs, and to try to understand how we can work together. I think this is the most important. But once again, we've been in the very beginning of the discussions.
And I hope we'll keep on discussing, and maybe at some point do this pilot in Morocco. Heidi, right now, what are your main challenges? Is it technology? Is it deployment, commercial deployment?
No, well, so yes and no. I think the biggest challenge for us right now is because ultimately we are a data company. This is what we aspire to be, right? We're providing insights, and we've got algorithms that come off of all these sophisticated biosensors. But at the early stage we're in, this kind of harkens back a little bit to what Balazs was saying. We're a hardware company, right? So we manufacture hardware, which is very expensive. And so once you get to scale, and your revenues this becomes a very simple thing, because you're manufacturing tens of thousands, and it's not a problem. So I think the biggest problem we're seeing right now is we're starting to get real demands, whereby before demand meant for us, we're doing a pilot or we're doing a small rollout, 50 to 100 people. But now, we're hearing within the next few months, and so we'll see if all of these come to fruition. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But we're starting to explore situations where it's 500 devices up to, one mining company saying up to 40,000, which is phenomenal. But us thinking through how do we get from where we are now, which we've gone from small to mid-tier manufacturing, to that large scale. How do we prepare for that? Financially and just infrastructurally. So somebody else is doing it, but we operationally just scaling very quickly. So it's those types of growing pains. And when you're at the stage we're at, there's a lead time. Just, the medium batch manufacturing, which can be up to 8 weeks. So you can't be as opportunistic as you want to be. If a customer comes to you and says, shoot, it's really hot and we'd love to roll out 3,000 devices in 2 weeks, we can't always take advantage of that now. A year from now, hopefully we can. So we have to plan more than we'd like, and our lead times are just long enough that sometimes we're missing opportunities. So that's what we're working on internally right now, is how do we get to the point where we can scale up and take advantage of things, in a reasonable way, and still keep the company running as it should, because investing in hardware is, it's quite expensive. So I'd say that's our biggest challenge.
Perfect, thank you. I will wait a bit to have to see if there is other questions from the audience. We had one from Yogesh before. Let me say before that if someone wants more information or to get in touch with Heidi and Kenzen, you can do so in the expo section, where there is a booth for Kenzen, but also with the 10 other startups from the Catalyst program. You can also write directly to me or to Heidi. I will ask Heidi and Balazs to put their emails in the chat for later use if you want to get in touch with them directly. I will see if there is any questions and wait a bit. I think we have been really complete today. I will put my
Probably
email.
said too much. They're like, I've heard enough. I'm done.
So Heidi and Balazs, you can put your email in the global chat. Well, I think there is no other questions. So thank you all for joining. Thank you to Balazs and thank you, Heidi, for your presentation. The next panel will take place on Monday at the same time and will feature Converge.io. Its first product is Concrete DNA. It's a digital tool following the curing of concrete and relying on sensors directly attached to the steel rubber cages to wirelessly transmit information such as temperature, humidity, and compressive strength. Thank you all and have a good day or a good night. Bye.
Thank you very much.